The western part of North Carolina is known as a wild and lush region with densely forested mountains, deep gorges, raging rivers, and scenic beauty to be found nowhere else in the world. The hot pink and fuchsia rhododendron pop against the dark green pines and hardwood foliage. Waist-high ferns flourish on the pine needle-covered forest floor, and a smoky blue haze clings selfishly to the mountains and settles in the valleys. This is just outside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. US Highway 74 slinks and slithers through the valleys and over the gaps from Murphy to Asheville. But it wasn't always there. The first economical route of transport through this rugged wilderness was the railroad. In the late 1820s, railroad construction began to boom in the South. It encompassed some of the most ambitious development projects to date. By 1860, the Southern Railroad network was one of the most extensive in the world. However, the larger tragedy is that most of it was built with slave labor. In fact, railroad companies became some of the largest owners of slaves in the South. Railroad companies bought and sold slaves with contracts and conditions of labor, complete with printed, complex bills of sale. These slaves were reported as human property via gains and losses to company stockholders, and were carefully accounted for in company ledgers. As early as 1844, Louisiana set a precedent for not only using slave labor, but also leasing out criminals for pay, which would allow criminals who were incarcerated to be leased out for work. The practice made money for the jails, the states, and the companies who leased them as nearly free labor. This would not gain widespread use, however, until after the Civil War ended and the slaves were freed under Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Although the South's railroad network was extensive, it was not prepared to handle the amount of traffic brought forth by the Civil War. The gauges of the different lines were not standard, and the workmanship was shoddy at best. Not only heavy freight and traffic caused widespread damage to the Southern railways, but the Union Army was notorious for destroying portions of the network. Union soldiers, led by General Sherman, reportedly took up the rails, heated them, and wrapped them around trees. This became affectionately known as Sherman's bow ties. Between the Union Army, no maintenance, and extremely heavy usage, the Southern railways were in absolute shambles by the end of the war. While the railroads were critical in cutting off Confederate supply trains, they became even more critical in the reconstruction of the South. The U.S. government understood the importance of restoring these railroads in order to connect the economical hubs of the North with the farms and products from the South. This new endeavor opened up many new job opportunities for Southerners who no longer had farms or plantations. Industries like lumber, steel, coal, and iron became crucial to rebuilding the railways. Slowly, agricultural industries came back to life, as Southerners were once again able to sell their crops and products. Rebuilding the railroad did not come easily. Because there was no standard gauge or distance between the rails, engineers had to create one, 4 feet, 8.5 inches. By standardizing the gauge, the engineers could lay down track quickly and more efficiently. Another problem was labor. There simply weren't enough men willing to work on the railroads after the catastrophic losses during the war. And while the railroads were being rebuilt, there was still a great deal of resentment among the Southern states for the loss of the Confederacy, the freeing of the slaves, and the Northern intervention in the affairs of the South. While 4 million slaves were freed, Southern states still devised ways to circumvent their emancipation. One of these was called the Black Codes, a set of rules meant to restrict free movement among African Americans and to force them into employment. If any person, usually men, were accused and convicted of violating the Black Codes, they were sent to prison. Infractions could be anything and included petty crimes ranging from vagrancy to loitering. The sentences were often very harsh. Enter the birth of the American chain gang. Since the prisons and jails were now bursting at the seams with newly convicted African American men, the states decided to lease them out for labor. During the period of Reconstruction, convict leasing became widespread. Because the act of convict leasing was so lucrative, states leased prisoners to plantations and private corporations, like the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company and the Chattahoochee Brick Company. The lessees, or those hiring the prisoners, were responsible for clothing, housing, and food. To give an example of how much money could be made in 1898, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from convict leasing. North Carolina finally prohibited the system of convict leasing in 1933. So what was life like for these leased criminals? By all accounts, life was a living hell. The work was very hard. Discipline was harsh. Food and shelter were barely adequate. There were swindlers at every corner looking to make a quick buck by whatever shady method they could find. The railroad camps were the worst. They had to work on mountains and in valleys. They had to build bridges and dig tunnels. The work was exhausting and very dangerous. By the 1870s, railroad construction was booming, and not just in the South. Prior to 1871, there were 45,000 miles of track laid. But between 1871 and 1900, there were 170,000 miles of track added. Congress authorized the construction of railroads that spanned the entire country, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, called the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. The first transcontinental railroad was finished on May 10, 1869. As railroads expanded to the westernmost part of the nation, other ethnic groups were working in the camps, including Chinese and Irish immigrants. As the railroads were being rebuilt in the South, nearby economies improved and eventually began to boom. In 1880, the new rails reached Asheville, North Carolina. The next year, workers started digging, filling, and blasting a 116-mile extension from Asheville to Murphy, called the Murphy Branch. Engineer Captain J.W. Wilson was the man responsible for undertaking this monumental task. Wilson and his men were challenged to construct an 836-foot-long tunnel outside of Dillsboro. Balsam Mountain was very steep and curvy, with gaping ravines. Once the rails were in place, they were laid at an elevation of 3,100 feet, making this the highest railway in the eastern United States. The tunnel, to be called the Cowie Tunnel, was located just west of Dillsboro and was intended to cut through a mountain, shortening the distance of the railroad instead of going around a huge meandering loop alongside the Tuckasegee River. The tunnel would blast through a mountain between the Tuckasegee River and the Laurel Branch. The Murphy Branch was built by leased convicts from the prison in Raleigh. The men worked at gunpoint and were shackled together. The actual railroad force varied from 150 to 500 workers. Many of these workers were veterans who had worked on the railroad for at least 3 years. They were possibly the same crew involved in building the tunnels at Swannanoa. They were under supervision of J.M. McMurray and E.B. Stamps. On the morning of December 30th, 1882, 30 prisoners, all shackled together, waited on the bank of the Tuckasegee River to be ferried across to work at the tunnel. The night before, however, it had rained and was below freezing. The boat had a fair amount of water and slush in it, but was still able to carry up to 50 men. While crossing the river, the water and slush from the rain began to shift. Thinking the boat was sinking, several of the prisoners panicked and quickly moved to the opposite end of the boat, causing it to capsize. People watched helplessly from the bank as the men were dumped into the frigid water. Because they were shackled together at their ankles, their efforts to swim away just entangled them into a hopeless, mangled mess. One by one, the men sank. Surprisingly, one of the men, Anderson Drake, managed to get loose and swim to shore. Drake supposedly rescued a guard by the name of Fleet Foster by pulling him out of the freezing water. Normally, this heroic act would have won him a pardon. However, Foster, embarrassed by being saved by one of the prisoners, would later plant his wallet in Drake's duffel bag. Instead of a pardon, Drake was sentenced to 10 lashes with a leather strap and 30 years of hard labor. The rest of the men who drowned were later pulled from the river. Nobody knows exactly where the 19 men were buried on January 1st, 1883. Most accounts claim that they were buried in a mass grave above the tunnel. But local oral history claims that there are 3 unmarked mass graves on a hillside near the tunnel. Further legend states that because of his harsh sentence of 30 years hard labor back with the railroad, Drake himself cursed the tunnel out of anger and despair. Local legend states that Cowie Tunnel has always been plagued by disaster. There were multiple cave-ins during construction. Water continues dripping from the ceiling to this day, and folklore states that it may be from the tears of the drowned men crying about being hastily buried in an unmarked mass grave above the tunnel. The interior is very dark, and a blind curve has been responsible for severe accidents and derailments in the past. As for the 19 men that perished, after remaining nameless for 130 years, all 19 men have now been identified by a Western North Carolina local, Gary Carden. An effort called the Going Home Project is currently underway to locate the remains, to identify each of them, to send them home to their living relatives, to be properly interred and to honor them. Carden interviewed residents and researched archives to discover that the bodies were in fact buried on a nearby hillside that was once a meadow in 1883. Although it is now covered in pine needles and thickets, the graves have been found and the search is underway for living relatives. Carden and the others involved also want to see a statue erected in downtown Dillsboro to honor the men who drowned. The Cowie Tunnel disaster highlighted not only the hazardous work involved in building railroads, but it also brought to life in glaring technicolor the horrors of the treatment of African Americans in our nation's history. A solemn reminder that ultimate prosperity for the United States came at the price of countless lives, leased and sold for mere pennies. My name is Scott, and thank you so much for watching. We're a group of curious and passionate humans, creating documentary-style content for those who share our curiosity, ask questions, and seek to dig deeper in a world where almost everything isn't quite what it seems. We are Mystery Syndicate. If you like what we do, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, leave a comment, and give this video a like. And to be notified when we post new videos, hit that notification bell. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and for exclusive merchandise, visit our website at www.mysterysyndicate.com. And for those that wish to support our channel, please visit Mystery Syndicate on Patreon. We have a variety of new patron tiers with tons of great benefits. If you want to see your name on a future video, be sure to check it out. From all of us at Mystery Syndicate, thank you again. We sincerely appreciate your support.